Okay, so now we're going to talk about ecological studies, and here's our trusty evidence hierarchy. And so you see we just talked about case reports and case series. We talked a little about case control, but we're going to move slowly up this pyramid, well, hopefully not too slowly. So now we're on ecologic studies. And as you remember from the first video, ecologic studies are what we're calling descriptive studies as opposed to analytic studies. So these three up here are all analytic studies, and these are all descriptive studies. Another way I think that the USMLE calls them observational studies, these in particular observational studies. But anyway, so let's talk about them. So the key to ecological studies is that the measures in the study are characteristics of groups rather than individuals. So this map here shows that, for an example, like you might look at one measure might be the rate of, say, hypertension in a particular country, and you may link that rate of hypertension or prevalence of hypertension in the country to some exposure, okay? And that exposure is also a country level variable. So, for example, the amount of salty products that are sold annually in the country, and link that to hypertension in the country. So the point is that while many studies are looking at individuals, ecological studies are looking at groups. So I'll give you a couple examples. So here's an example of a great ecological study, one of my personal favorites. So what this study shows is the prevalence of hypertension in these different populations. Okay, so this prevalence is obviously a measure of a group rather than an individual. So it's not whether an individual has hypertension or not, it's the prevalence of hypertension within the whole group. So this is looking at Nigeria. In the population of Nigeria, prevalence of hypertension is around 12%. In the population of Canada, prevalence of hypertension is almost 30%, just below 30%, and so on, okay? And the point of this particular study was to look at racial differences in hypertension. So within the United States, it's pretty well known that blacks have much higher prevalence of hypertension than whites. And you can see in the U.S. the hypertension prevalence on this graph is broken down by race. So you see U.S. whites are below 30%, whereas U.S. blacks are extremely high. This was in 2005, it may be even higher now. 45% of U.S. blacks have hypertension. And so this within the states has often been attributed to genetics, a genetic difference between blacks and whites. But what is shown in this chart here, and was discovered in this study, or pointed out in the study, was that look at Nigeria, which is a African population, well, they are African, has very low prevalence of hypertension. And looking at Jamaica, which is also an African population, population from Africa, prevalence in this population, okay, is only slightly higher than the prevalence in U.S. whites. And then you go to U.S. blacks, and then you're seeing a much higher prevalence. But by looking at it in this way, you can get a pretty strong impression that it's not genetic. So it's not having an African genetic heritage that is related to hypertension. So you can rule out, this provides strong evidence for ruling out the hypothesis that it's an African genetic heritage that is causal of high prevalence of hypertension. And so what makes this an ecological study is, again, that it's groups, rates of hypertension in groups, and looking at the genetic origins or, genetics of these different populations by breaking them down in this way. So that's one example of a nice kind of conclusion that you can draw from a ecological study. So this is an example of a comparative ecological study, which is a study that compares multiple groups at a single point in time. So we're going to talk about other kinds of studies that look at a single group over time. So this shows an example of a study that looks at changes over time, an ecological study that looks at changes over time. So this study looks at smoking prevalence in Italy, and the question is whether a new law that outlawed smoking in all indoor public places, whether that law, which was instituted in 2005 right here, had any impact on smoking prevalence. And so what they did is they plotted prevalence of smoking in these different years among for the Italian population. So there was a poll, it's like a Gallup poll that was done in 1990 and then again in 2000 and every year following that. And this poll asked people whether they smoke or not. And so what's plotted here is the prevalence of smoking in these different groups. So we've got males, females, and then total. And then what we look at here is the change per year in smoking prevalence prior to the law in 2005 and then after the law. And so you can see they're arguing from this data that the change was much less. The decrease in smoking prevalence was lower before the law than after the law. And so there was a systematic reduction in the number of people who are smoking, but what they argue is that that reduction increased dramatically after the law. So this is a case of another ecological study because it's looking at groups and it's looking at changes over time in those groups as opposed to comparing groups at a single point in time. So of course there are strengths and limitations to ecological studies. Ecological studies are fast and cheap, and this is mainly because they use information that's already available. So for example, hypertension statistics by country are often generated by the country, and there's other data also generated by the country that you can correlate or use to look at the association between different variables at a group level. So they're fast and cheap. And also they're used to generate hypotheses, just like case series and other, and then cross-sectional studies that we're going to talk about. Limitations, one is that they can't control for the effects of confounding factors. I'm not going to talk about that now, but we'll get back to it when we talk about confounding. Second, there's no information on the level of exposure. So when you're doing a group study, you just have a group level variable. So for example, you may look at the relationship between hypertension in a country and cardiovascular disease in the same country. And you may see that there's a relationship so that the countries or groups, groups of individuals with higher prevalence of hypertension also have higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease. However, you don't know the level of exposure of to hypertension or that specific blood pressure in those individuals because, well, you may know it in the individuals, but at a group level you just have one number that characterizes the group. So you don't have level of exposure because you don't have individual. And finally, the ecological fallacy is a limitation of the ecological study design. So the ecological fallacy, you can also call it the aggregation bias, is the assumption that relationships which apply at a group level also apply at an individual level.